Welcome back to Public Speaking. Today we're going to wrap up our unit on communication theory by talking about the most important aspects of the communication process in tandem with your reading of Chapter 1 of your course textbook. Let's begin by asking, what do you see? If you can read French, then you know that the text says this is not a pipe. But at the same time, it absolutely is a pipe. Yes? No? In one sense, it's a pipe, or at least it signifies or represents a pipe. In another, very real sense, it's a picture of a pipe. So we've reintroduced the concept of a paradox, something that is itself and a contradiction of itself in the same breath. If you will look at the bottom right-hand corner of the painting, you'll notice the signature of René Magritte. You've probably seen paintings such as this, more well-known works by René Magritte. René Magritte is one of my favorite surrealist artists of the 20th century, for a few reasons. Number one, he was a dog lover. Number two, he is probably one of the most famous surrealist artists, so famous in fact that Paul Simon devoted an entire song to him. And number three, he had a wonderful quotation about communication that I'll paraphrase. In it, Magritte said, "Everything that we mean is obscured by what we say, and everything that we say is always hidden by what we try to mean." Again, another paradox. And this paradox introduces the main thrust of our lecture, which are the three traits of the communication process, or in order to acronym them, we'll call them the 3 C's of the communication process. And the first of those 3 traits is clarity. Another way to describe clarity is that clarity is the transparency between what Chapter 1 of your textbook calls the sender and either the receiver or the listener. The greater the clarity in a conversation or in a communication context, the more apt that it is that the sender's message is received by the receiver or listener in much the same way as it was intended. So if you've ever been in a situation where you said something but had it interpreted in quite the wrong way, then that was probably a conversation or a communication context that suffered in its clarity. Let's define clarity in more depth. If we had to define or describe clarity, it would probably be the measure of transmission's felicity. And felicity is just another word for success. In other words, clarity is a measurement of communication. How clear communication is how much the sender's message is interpreted correctly by the receiver. George Bernard Shaw once said, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." So if you've ever been sitting in a lecture and you absolutely didn't understand what your professor or instructor was saying, but still taking down notes, then we can say that clarity was severely degraded in the communication context, because your instructor or professor probably thought that you were understanding what they were saying, when in fact you were not. Understanding clarity means also understanding what communication is. And while your textbook doesn't have a hard and fast definition of communication, we're going to define it as the process of creating or sharing meaning through interaction. But this, of course, compels the question, what is meaning? If you had to define meaning, you'd probably be fairly hard-pressed. Some of us might define meaning as intention or purpose behind a message. Some of us might define meaning as what is interpreted, or the values, the ideas that we receive from messages. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But if we can make an observation about what meaning means in this sentence, we'd probably say that meaningful communication makes the unseen tangible. Think about the most important things in your life. They're most likely not necessarily things. They're probably things such as your values, your beliefs, your faith, or your relationships. And what all of those things have in common, if we were to Venn diagram them together, is the fact that they cannot be seen, heard, or felt. Now certainly you have lots of things that signify those ideals, those values, your relationships. You have images on your cellular device of your friends and your family. You might have a memento or a token that somehow embodies your faith in a meaningful way. But that's not the same thing as those ideals or values or beliefs or relationships themselves. So when we say meaningful communication, we're talking about something that makes the unseen seeable, tangible, concrete. That's what communication is all about. Or, to illustrate, whenever she found out that Robin Williams had taken his own life, Coco, the sign language gorilla, signed cry, lip. So that means meaningful communication can even convey our most profound emotions. Take a look at this. If you study the image very closely, what you'll probably realize is that you're looking at an image of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. These are serious Jews, and we can tell that because they've got their yarmulke, they've got their prayer shawl, they're touching the wall in a graceful yet reverent way, and while we don't know what book they are reading, we can probably presume it's a sacred religious text such as the Torah. And why can we presume that? Because of all the myriad ways that these individuals are conveying their faith for all of us. So why show this image? Because I think it succinctly demonstrates that even in our most intimate moments, and what could be more intimate than a serious Jew praying to their God at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem? Even in our most intimate moments, we are still communicating, conveying messages, conveying meaning. And that introduces the second aspect of communication, complexity. Your course textbook chapter mentioned something called a channel. In other words, a single message that we send can often be sent upon multiple channels, both verbal and nonverbal, to convey meaning. And that's what we're talking about whenever we discuss complexity. Complexity really refers to all of human interaction. In other words, complexity relates to all of human behavior. And since most of communication is unconscious and nonverbal, it requires understanding more than facts. In the book The Hidden Dimension, it's postulated that as much as 70 to 90% of human meaning is derived from nonverbal cues or channels. And when you compound that with the fact that most of nonverbal communication is done involuntarily by senders or communicators, that means most of us are unaware of most of the meaning that we convey, whether you realize it or not. As you listen to this lecture, how much sleep you got last night, your socioeconomic status, aspects of your culture, your interests, they're all being communicated by what you've chosen to wear today and how you've chosen to present yourself in public or in private. So that means that because human interaction, human communication is so complex and intricate, it requires contravance or a contrived system to explain involuntary activities. We've already been introduced to one of these contrivances whenever we discussed communication apprehension, because we distinguish between apprehension and anxiety and fear. In casual conversation, we don't make those distinctions, but because communication is a way of taking a step back and looking from the outside in at a set of behaviors that we're all embroiled in constantly, that means we need that contravance to better understand it. As Jackson Pollock said, abstract painting is abstract, it confronts you. There was a reviewer a while back who wrote that my pictures didn't have any beginning or any end. He didn't mean it as a compliment, but it was. It reminds me of another story about Pablo Picasso, who once found himself sitting in a train compartment across from one of his most damning critics. The critic said to him, "You're that Picasso fellow. I hate abstract art." And then he pulled out his wallet, and he said, "See?" handing Picasso a photograph. "That is art. That is my wife." Picasso took the photograph and said, "Then your wife is very small and awfully flat." And what Picasso was trying to convey with that sentiment is the fact that all of communication, regardless of how concrete or tangible, is to some extent an abstraction. And this is not a new idea. In fact, it was first postulated by Charles S. Peirce in the late 19th century. He discerned that the basic unit of all communication is something that he dubbed the sign, and he defined it in this way. A sign is an object which stands for another to some mind. If it is not a sign to any mind, then it is not a sign at all. It must be known to the mind first in its material qualities. That mind must be connected with its object so that it is possible to reason from the mind of the thing. Sign produces a certain idea in the mind, which is the idea that it is a sign of the thing it signifies, and an idea itself is a sign. As you might imagine, this is a fairly confusing definition, and it's important to remember that Charles S. Peirce is generally regarded as one of the foremost philosophers in the United States in the late 19th century, perhaps the entire 19th century. And even he uses that word sign 6 times in his definition of the word sign. Eventually, Peirce revised his understanding of the sign and broke it into 3 constituent parts. This is an example of the first sign that Peirce defined. No, that's not the Joker. Remember, it's a picture of the Joker. See how quickly we forget Magritte's lesson about this is not a pipe? See how quickly we forget Picasso's lesson about abstraction. And that's because this sign, or icon, is a sign of visual comparison. So because icons are visually compared to their objects, they're very simple. You don't have to be literate to understand what a sign is. For example, look at the image in the right hand of this slide. You'll see a small boy next to a cosplayer who's dressed as the superhero The Flash. In this instance, this boy went up to this cosplayer because he got lost from his parents, and he knew, because he watched cartoons at home, that the Flash was a good person and would help him find his family. So essentially, this child apprehended the use of signs. He compared the images that he saw on his television set to the images, or in fact the individuals that he saw at a convention. The same thing happens whenever you show a photograph of a child's mother to an infant and they point to that photograph and say Mama or Dada. They are understanding how to use the tool of the icon, because icons represent their objects through resemblance. All of us do the exact same thing whenever we have to go to the restroom in public, and we have to choose between the disembodied circle over the rectangular body or the disembodied circle over the triangular body. Because signs, icons, are incredibly elastic or pliant. Sometimes they represent a very specific object, such as Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker, and sometimes they literally represent half of the human race's population. And the reason that they are so elastic and pliant is because they duplicate their object through a visual medium. The second kind of sign is called the index, which is a sign that's created through experience and stimuli, which is another way to say that indexes are connected through their objects by way of cause and effect. So if you were to hear a knock and your door was closed, you might think that somebody wandered inside your door. So that means that you've connected the object and the sign through an interplay of sense and memory. You heard, sense, the knock. And your memory or your prior experiences tell you that that means somebody probably wants in the door. If you have certain scents that you find repellent because you can't eat certain foods because the last time you ate that food it made you incredibly ill, then that's an index at play in your memory. If you walk by a perfume counter in a department store and you're reminded of your grandmother because she wore the exact same kind of perfume that they're selling at that counter, again, that's an index. So indexes point to their object rather than merely represent them. And finally, the last of Peirce's signs is the symbol. In fact, the most prevalent kind of symbol that we use on a daily basis is on this slide. Can you guess what it is? No, it's not the heart, and it's not the eyeball. It's the word, symbols. Words are symbols, which is another way to say that as symbols, they represent through abstract signs, because there's no innate relationship between, for example, the letters E, G, G, and the thing you might crack open and eat for breakfast every day. So symbols are based upon predetermined standards. Standards like spelling, grammar, syntax, because they have no innate resemblance to their object. They're regulated by formal and informal laws. Formal laws such as encyclopedias and dictionaries, and informal laws such as taboos. In other words, it's appropriate to say some words or phrases in some places but not in others. And because there is no innate resemblance between a symbol and its object, they're the most dynamic of sign systems. Think about all the different kinds of words that have radically changed in their meaning over the past century. Words like gay or tyrant. In the early Middle Ages, the word tyrant simply meant property owner. But as you might imagine, if you're a vassal or a serf to a liege lord who owns property, you probably don't have a very favorable opinion of that tyrant or liege lord. So that by the time William Shakespeare writes the tragedy of Julius Caesar, sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, already has a negative connotation. Look to the left of the slide, and you'll see another version of a symbol, the thumbs up. Do you know where the thumbs up came from? No, it's not hitchhiking. It's from gladiatorial combat. Gladiatorial combat used thumbs up and thumbs down to either represent life or death for the participants in those sports venues. Do you know which one is which? It's a trick question. Nobody's really sure. Our earliest record of thumbs up and thumbs down comes from Juvenal and Against the Cities of Rome, written several centuries after the height of gladiatorial combat. He writes, "Now they give shows of their own, thumbs up, thumbs down, and the killers spare or slay, and then go back to concessions for private privies." Now it's suspected that thumbs down actually meant, let the gladiator survive, keep them down here a bit longer. Thumbs up probably meant, send them to the gods, cut their head off. But we now feel that thumbs up has the positive connotation, and not vice versa. Most likely because a Hollywood producer decided sometime in the 1950s, that's dumb. Let's just have thumbs up be life and thumbs down be death. And because there's no innate resemblance between thumbs up and thumbs down and life or death, we have the dynamism of symbols as signs. The final of the 3 C's that we'll discuss today is collectivity. So one question that we have to compel ourselves with is, if communication is not concrete, why should we interact ethically with others? In other words, why should we do things like tell the truth? I can imagine some of the answers that you might be giving. But it's okay for you to tell the truth, but what if I want to lie? What if I want to become powerful or wealthy or accede to some kind of political office? All of those things are not being collective in our communication. And why is that a bad thing? Well, I'd like you to imagine a scenario, a prisoner's dilemma. 2 potential thieves are caught. They're brought to the police station. They're isolated from one another. And they're told that they have one of 2 choices. They can either confess or they can deny the charges. They're told that if both of them confess, without knowing what the other person is doing, they'll both only receive 6 months in prison. But if one of them confesses and one of them denies, the person that denied is going to walk off scot-free. The person that confesses gets 10 years in prison. And if they both deny, then they both get 5 years in prison. So without knowing what the other person does, ideally both of them should confess, because it's really the only way that they can both prevent suffering egregiously, even though they both have to endure a 6-month sentence. That prisoner's dilemma is a lot like the collectivity of communication. Communication itself is a collective system with shared ownership. Imagine that all of us, in order to eat every day, had to do something like fish in a gigantic lake or pool. That pool was incredibly clear, so we had no trouble catching as many fish as we wanted to. But imagine if someone dropped a little bit of ink into that pool. Now, it's only one person and it's only one time, so we still don't have much problem in the way of finding our daily fish. But what if every person, every day, put at least one drop of ink in that pool? Pretty soon it'd be very difficult to find any fish. Communication is a lot like that. One breach of the system, one drop of ink in that pool, can threaten the entire system, because now none of us can trust communication if we know that at least one person is being deceitful or lying. Many years ago, maybe even tens of thousands of years ago, a person said to another person, "I love you," and they meant it. But then somebody took that same phrase and they said it, and for whatever reason they didn't mean it. So they had to say it in front of a third person, now a witness. And then someone didn't mean it in front of a witness. So then they added rings and ceremonies and certificates and blood tests and on and on and on. Why? All because we have to verify the meaning that we create with the tangible and concrete aspects of communication. That's why collectivity, whether you're an honest person or not an honest person, is so important. Because we all rely on communication to make meaning, and none of us want to live in a meaningless universe. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. Don't forget to complete your discussion journal in tandem with this assignment. Feel free to reach out to me via email or message if you have any questions.